Press R, I dare you. Well, when you phrase it like that, that sounds like a challenge, so that's a challenge I can't back down from. Whoa, 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 what is happening right now? What is happening with this game, bro? Oh my god, I need to get out of here. This is too insane. Alright, so that just happened. Yeah, the purpose of that, whatever that thing was with the sky, whatever that was doing, that was supposed to represent user input service, I guess. So it's basically how we're able to detect user input from the player whenever we're making our Roblox games. So an input could be if I'm clicking my mouse in the game, if I'm pressing W to move forward, if I'm just pressing any sort of keys that are on my keyboard right now. You can actually see that in the output down here, it's detecting every time I do any sort of input that is just going to print the string input. That's because we're able to detect when the player is pressing down on a key on whatever device that they're playing on. So for me, I'm playing on a computer, but let's say I was playing on a mobile device, then we would probably detect when the player is moving or pressing the jump button, or just pressing buttons on an Xbox controller or a PS4 controller now that Roblox is on PS4. So things like that. And I want to be able to introduce this concept in Roblox Studio so that you will know how to detect user input and also creating the best experience for players depending on the device that they are playing on. So if that interests you, then you should stick around till the end of this video. So with that being said, let's go straight into implementing. All right, let's think about this for a minute. You can see that with UserInputService, the thing we're going to be talking about in this episode, there's so much to uncover with this concept that I'm going to be here forever if I'm going to try and go through every single thing that's inside of this documentation. So what I'm going to do in this episode is give you a general introduction to how you can use UserInputService to get user input and also configure your game depending on what device the user is playing on. I'm going to treat this episode as an introduction more than an in-depth guide compared to some of my other episodes. And maybe in the future, I will dive deeper into some of these concepts in specific videos. But for the purposes of this episode, I'm just gonna go over some basic stuff for UserInputService, and hopefully you will be able to experiment with UserInputService on your own time, or stick with me for future videos where I talk more deeply into some of these concepts with UserInputService. So with that being said, let's now go and start implementing this in Roblox Studio. Now that we understand it, let's add user input into our game. There's two important use cases to use UserInputService, at least for the sake of this video, where the first one is detecting user input. So if they're pressing down a button while they're playing the game, and just things like that. The second use case is detecting what device the player is playing on so that we can give them the best experience depending on what they're playing on. Because obviously, when a player is playing on a mobile device, the experience is a lot different than playing on a PC. So that's something we're going to have to detect in our game using UserInputService. And before we start adding it, you might ask, does this belong in a script or a local script? So UserInputService is only local sided. This cannot be done on the server. This can only be done from the player directly. So you're gonna have to put this in a local script, probably somewhere that fits it best, like starter character scripts. So let's hit the plus sign next to starter character scripts, and let's insert a local script. So let's delete this, and first thing we will do is make reference to UserInputService. We're going to say local UserInputService equals game:get service UserInputService. So the first part of this video is just detecting user input whenever they press down on any key. This is going to use a function called InputBegan, and this is pretty much what it's going to look like. So we're going to say UserInputService.InputBegan: connect function open and close parentheses enter. So this InputBegan event takes in two function parameters. The first one is the user input, and then the other one is a Boolean that's called GameProcessedEvent. I'm gonna go over what this one does in a little bit, but for now we're gonna focus on the input, which is basically an input object made by Roblox themselves that contains information that tell us what type of input the user is currently pressing down on when this event fires. So if we were to not pay attention to the input and just simply do something whenever the user does anything related to user input, let's just make a print statement really quickly just to see whether this is working or not. So we'll just simply say input, and then let's see what this looks like when we play the game. So in the game, I can literally do anything to make it so that the InputBegan event will fire. I can right click and it will say input has been printed down here. I can move around and it'll constantly print out input because I'm pressing down on multiple keys while I'm moving my character. If I jump or just like really press anything on my keyboard, then it's going to activate the InputBegan event. And this basically applies with any input that I do. So not only is this going to work with keyboard and mouse, but this would also apply to if you're playing on a phone, a tablet, or even on an Xbox or PS4. Just any sort of input will be detected using the InputBegan. But this is important to note when we're pressing down on a key and not when we're lifting it back up. I'm going to show you how we're going to detect that in a little bit. So let's go back to our script, and we can see that this is basically being printed anytime we press any input. So it doesn't really matter what input it is, as long as we're pressing down something. But now let's say we wanted to focus on specifically which input we want to look out for whenever we're pressing down a key. So let's say we want the player to press a specific key, then we want it to do something once we know that we press something. So with my very weird example from the beginning where I pressed R and that specifically triggered something, we can do that using this input that was passed in to check whether this input was specifically R. So we're going to do that down here by dropping 2 lines, and we're just going to do a simple if statement. We're just going to say if input. Now, the thing about input is that this is an input object and it has multiple properties that are layered onto this input object. The thing we're most interested in is the key that was pressed. So this property is called KeyCode, which is an enum value, which describes the kind of input that is being pressed from the user. So this is how we're going to detect whether the input is the one we're looking for. It's not just input because input is an object. We're looking for the KeyCode property. So then we're going to say if this is equal to R, so we can do it like this as a character, but the more conventional way of doing this is by using an enum value from KeyCode. So you know how KeyCode is an enum value? We want this to match a KeyCode enum that exists in Roblox's library already. So we're going to do that by saying enum.KeyCode dot, and as you can see, there's a whole list of options that we can choose from using this KeyCode enum. Now, KeyCode is a specific thing for certain keyboards, so this will not work for devices such as phones, tablets, and consoles. This is specifically for keyboards. So let's say we want it to be R. Then we're going to say print player has pressed R. So this is the syntax we're going to use to figure out whether the player has pressed down the R key using the KeyCode enum from our user input. So let's go into the game and try this out. All right, so over here, I'm just spamming my keyboard to print input, but I'm not pressing R yet. Now when I do press R, you can see that in the output, it says player has pressed R because we made a check to see if the KeyCode is equal to R specifically. Then we're going to execute whatever is down here and not just any random input that we set out InputBegan to detect. So that pretty much works as expected. So I mentioned that InputBegan has 2 arguments. So we have the input and then we have this random Boolean called GameProcessedEvent. What is this? So let's first write down what actually happens when we do check whether this GameProcessedEvent is true or not. So let's just simply write if GameProcessedEvent, then print GameProcessedEvent. Now let's go into the game so I can demonstrate to you what this does. All right, so I'm in the game. Let's say, for instance, I want to type something in the chat for whatever reason. So I'm going to press the chat and then I'm just going to type in rat. I don't know, just like something completely random. Obviously, if I have a local script that's detecting user input, I needed to press down the RAT key to be able to type out this message. But what if I don't want to detect this user input while the user is just typing something in the chat? That's basically what GameProcessedEvent is. we're seeing whether the player is currently interacting with Roblox's GUI system, or I believe any GUI in general, as a matter of fact. I could be wrong about that. With certain interactions like this, especially with the chat, we don't all of a sudden want it to do what it needs to do with this script if, let's say, the player is chatting something using Roblox's GUI. That's where we detect with GameProcessedEvent. If the player is currently interacting with Roblox's GUI system, then we don't want to do the user input checking. So that's why in most cases, we would just simply return this InputBegan event. Because if, let's say, the user is typing something in the chat, we don't want to process this InputBegan event. We just want to simply return this with no issues whatsoever. And that's basically what GameProcessedEvent is. I hope that made sense to you. All right, so we have an event for InputBegan, which is basically when the player presses down on a key. But now let's try making another event to detect when the player lifts the key back up. We will do that using an event called InputEnded. So down here, the syntax is relatively similar-ish. So we're gonna say UserInputService.InputEnded, connect function, open parentheses, close parentheses, input, and then GameProcessedEvent. And this will pretty much fire whenever the player lifts a key off of the keyboard, or any input in general. So we're gonna say user has lifted the input. And so we can go into the game and see this change anytime I press down a key and then lift it back up. So I'm going to hold the left mouse button. So I'm going to press the left mouse button. It still says the input is down there, but then when I let go, it says user has lifted the input. So this pretty much happens whenever we just let go of any sort of keys. So I'm currently pressing S. If I let go, then it's going to say user has lifted the input. And this can be done for every single input, InputBegan and InputEnded. So that's one quick little thing I wanted to introduce there to get you familiar with that. So over here, we detected user input based on the key that they were pressing on the keyboard. But obviously there's way more different types of input other than just keys on the keyboard, like my mouse or a gamepad or mobile, things like that. We can do that using another property of input, not called KeyCode, but called UserInputType. And this is what it's going to look like. So let's detect if the player is pressing the left mouse button. We're going to do that by typing if input.UserInputType equals, and this is going to be another enum value. So we're going to say enum.UserInputType dot, and there's a whole bunch of options here. So mouse button 1 is basically our left mouse button, and then there's mouse button 2, which is our right mouse button, and then mouse button 3, which is like the little mouse scroll wheel if we press that down. And then there's a bunch of other stuff too that we're not really gonna worry too much about as of right now. So we're gonna say mouse button 1, then print user is pressing the left mouse button. And so if we try this out in game, this is how we're going to detect mouse clicks in our game. So I'm going to hit the left mouse button and it's going to say user is pressing the left mouse button, and this will only work with the left one. If I try pressing the right one, it's not going to print the left mouse button, or if I even press the middle button, it's not going to say left mouse button. Mouse button 1 is specifically the left mouse button. And so that's pretty much how that works. We can do the same thing with mouse button 2, mouse button 3, and we can also do this with different device inputs as well. We can say touch, which basically means that the user is on a touch device. So like a mobile device like an iPhone or a tablet. This is how we can detect that using this. And even a gamepad as well. So usually it would be gamepad 1 if we're just detecting player 1 on like an Xbox or a PS4. This is how we would detect that. It's pretty much one way of detecting the type of user input just by using UserInputType when we're checking this in our InputBegan event. So this was one way of detecting the user input type of whether the user is playing on a phone, a tablet, a console, things like that. But there's actually an easier way to do this without doing this if statement check inside of this InputBegan event, because UserInputService has these properties that automatically tell us whether the user is playing on a specific device. So these properties are usually named after the device that they're playing on. So touch enabled is telling us if the player is on a mobile device. Gamepad enabled is if we're playing on a console, and things like that. It's pretty simple actually. So let's drop 2 lines up here. to make a check whenever the player joins into the game to see what device they're playing on. We're just simply going to say if UserInputService.touchEnabled. So this one tells us if the user's device has a touch screen, so this is usually for mobile phones. We're going to then say print player is playing on a mobile device. And we can do something cool with this as well to really show us the difference. So we're going to say workspace : wait for child baseplate, and we're going to put in a wait for child so that it can load in fast enough. .color equals color3 from RGB. We're probably going to do some blue color. Hit OK, and then let's go into the game and try this out. All right, so we're in the game, and as you can see, the baseplate's color has changed to blue because we are playing on a phone. If I were to back out of this and then get off of device emulation to play on my PC, then this change should not happen since I'm now playing on a PC. So yeah, because now that I'm playing on a PC, the script is not going to tell me that I'm playing on a mobile device in order to change this baseplate's colors. So we were able to do that successfully, and we can do this with console as well, just by simply replacing touch enabled with gamepad enabled. And we can also do this with VR as well if you're playing Roblox VR, just by saying VR enabled. So these properties can pretty much signify whether the player is playing on a specific kind of device. And you can use this property from UserInputService to do specific things with the player experience, like changing GUIs to fit the player's screen better, or modify GUI screens, or modify user controls based on the device that they're playing on. And another instance I can think of that this would be very useful for is if you're using tools, where the tool will play out differently depending on the device that you're playing on, because a lot of the times tools require different controls for different devices that the user's playing on. You're not going to be able to press WASD if you're on a mobile phone, and this is especially true for tools if you're trying to press specific keys that you're not able to on a different device. So that's something else I wanted to throw in there. UserInputService also allows us to detect when the player is jumping using an event called JumpRequest. So this is what it's going to look like if we just go down here and then say UserInputService.JumpRequest. And this is basically going to fire every single time the player wants to make a request that they're jumping, also known as pressing the spacebar, or pressing the jump button or A button, whatever device that they're playing on, just making any request that makes the player jump. We're going to say connect function, open parentheses, close parentheses. This one has no arguments, so we can just hit enter. And now we could just print something like player has jumped. You might think that this is basically the only thing we need to do, but that's actually not correct, because let's say we do try playing the game and try to make a jump request. Let's see what happens in the output when we do try and jump. So I'm gonna hit spacebar, and down here, it said the player has jumped, but I only pressed spacebar one time, but for some reason, this printed 3 times. And if I try this again, I press spacebar, it's continuously printing 3 or 4 different times, maybe even more every time I just press the spacebar button. This especially happens when I'm holding down the spacebar, when it's just printing like this many times. The reason it's doing that is it's because the event is detecting when a jump request is happening, and a jump request can pretty much happen every millisecond that we try and attempt this jump request. So an easy solution to this is to wrap this in a debounce Boolean variable. So up here, we could just write a very quick Boolean by saying local is jumping equals false. And then down here, we can make a check by saying if not is jumping, then we will set is jumping equal to true. And then we're gonna take our print statement and then put it in here. And then what we'll do is put a task.wait statement over here, like maybe about 0.5 seconds, and then set is jumping back to false. So when the player does decide to jump, then we will make the script wait for a little bit before setting is jumping back to false so that we can make the jump request check again. And this should pretty much prevent our issue that we had before. All right, so I'm gonna hit jump and it says the player has jumped. So if I keep holding it, then it's going to print player has jumped whenever my character gets back down on the ground to then print it again in the output. So it pretty much now works as expected. This is very useful if we're trying to detect when the player is jumping, of course, and that is pretty much the end of that. What if we wanted to detect multiple key presses? There's actually a couple of ways we can do this, but the easiest way I know is by using a function inside of InputBegan whenever we press a new key. And this function is called IsKeyDown. So we can use this function to tell whether the player is currently holding down this key alongside this new key that they just pressed down. So we can probably do that by modifying this if statement right here with our InputBegan. So what if we wanted to hold the keys R and Q at the exact same time? We can pretty much do this by first checking whether the player is already holding down the Q key, and then we can fire this down here when the new input the player is pressing down on is R. Right before this, we're going to say if UserInputService is key down, and this takes in a KeyCode parameter. So we're going to say enum.keycode.q. And then what we're going to do is put an and here so that we're going to say if the Q key is currently being pressed down right now, and then our new input is going to be R, then we're going to print player has pressed R while holding Q. And so that's pretty much how we're going to detect whether multiple keys are being pressed at the same time. So let's hit play and see what happens. All right, so I'm pressing R. And as you can see, nothing's being printed right now because I need to hold Q first. So let's hold Q and then let's press R. So now it says player has pressed R while holding Q. So that is pretty much how we detect multiple keys at the same time. So now that we bring up the idea of pressing multiple keys, what if we wanted to do a double tap on a key? We'd pretty much do this using a feature called tick, which I don't expect you to know about because we never talked about this yet. But just for the sake of this example, you can follow what I do. But for a basic explanation, tick is basically a feature that lets us keep track of time in our script. What if, let's say, we wanted to detect whether a player is double tapping W to do some sort of cool functionality with it? We can first do that by creating an if statement down here saying if input.keycode equals enum.keycode.w, then print player has double pressed W. Now, obviously, if we do this, this is just one input of W, not double pressing, because we want to have the double press happen during a specific window of time so that it would count as a double press. So a double press would probably be like if we press W once and then press W twice, we want to have it in the span of like 0.5 seconds or something so that we can make it count as a double press and not just a single press. So up here, let's write a tick variable by saying local current tick equals tick, open and close parentheses. And then down here in our if statement, let's say and current tick minus tick is less than or equal to 0.2. Let's make it 0.2 in this case. And let's also wrap this condition in a parentheses so that we don't get confused with it. And then down here, let's write current tick equals tick open and close parentheses. So this is pretty much how we would be able to track in time whether the player is double pressing W or just pressing W singularly if it passes 0.2 seconds in between when we press W. Oops, I made a little typo here, my bad. So it's tick first and then minus current tick. My apologies on that. Let's play the game. All right, so I'm pressing W and nothing is being printed. If I press it again, nothing is being printed. If I double press it, then it's going to say player has double pressed W because we very quickly pressed W within the span of under 0.2 seconds or exactly at 0.2 seconds. So let's press it again. Nothing's being printed. Press it again. Nothing's being printed. And it's still not printing. So let's rapid tap it. And now it says player has double pressed W. So it's very quick. And obviously we can adjust this duration by changing this number from 0.2 to maybe 0.5 to make it more lenient. But you get the general idea. I don't expect you to know about tick until we discuss about it in a whole nother video, but this is one way of detecting whether a player is double tapping on a key. I think that'll pretty much wrap up the introduction to user input service. It's a very big feature that Roblox has, and I encourage you to go and try some of these other functions and events and all sorts of stuff on the API that Roblox has provided for you. It's a very big concept to know about because user input is one of the most fundamental things that scripts can do when making the best experience possible in the games that you're playing. If you've made it this far into the video, then I encourage you to watch my other videos on my advanced scripting tutorial playlist, or just check out any of my other videos that I have on my channel. But with that being said, that's pretty much where I'm going to end it. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to join my Discord server, the link's in the description, and I will see you in the next episode. Take care.